What's up? Mirte here. Let's talk about the anatomy of the central nervous system. In this segment, we will be talking about the internal surface of the spinal cord. Basically go through everything you need to know regarding the anatomy of the tracts and nuclei within the spinal cord. Alright, so the central nervous system consists of two parts, the encephalon and the spinal cord. So in this video, we're first going to go through the internal surface of the spinal cord and talk about the distribution of white and gray matter within it. Then we will look detailed into the anatomy of the gray matter and the anatomy of the white matter. Then at the end of this video, I've made a quiz which you will hopefully be able to pass based on this video. In our previous video, we looked at the topography and the external structures of the spinal cord, as well as the anatomy of the spinal nerve and the two types of reflex arches we have through the spinal cord. So if this is the first time you're studying the spinal cord, I recommend you to watch that first, because this video will make much more sense with you knowing the external surface of the spinal cord. Alright, we can start by taking a small segment of the spinal cord and look at the internal surface. It will look like this. The internal surface of the spinal cord consists of the gray matter and the white matter. The reason why they're called gray and white matter is because if you look at a neuron is colorless in general. And we know that because if you cut the spinal cord physically and look at it underneath the microscope without any significant staining, you will see that the neurons are gray. So the gray matter consists of nerve tissue rich in nerve cell bodies and dendrites. White matter consists of nerve tissue rich in myelinated axons and glia cells, as you see here. And the reason why myelinated axons are white is because they're rich in lipid, and lipids are white. And keep this in mind throughout this video, because you will notice as we go through the structures in the gray matter, we will be talking about nuclei or nucleus, because cell bodies are in the gray matter. When we're talking about the white matter, we have structures called tracts, which are axons. So let's start with the gray matter first. The gray matter consists of three horns. We have the anterior horn and a posterior horn, or Conu anterius and Conu posterius. And where is the last horn? The last horn is located in the spinal segments associated with the sympathetic and the parasympathetic fibers between C8 and L2 and S2 and S4 spinal cord segments. So if you cut the spinal cord within those areas, you will see that we have an anterior horn, a posterior horn, and a lateral horn that give off either sympathetic fibers or parasympathetic fibers. So this segment is from an area outside of the sympathetic or parasympathetic regions. Between the anterior and the posterior horn, there's an intermediate column. Then in the middle, there's a central zone with the central canal in the middle. The central canal is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, which is the same fluid as in the subarachnoid space. Around the central canal, there are cells called ependymal cells, forming a central gelatinous substance of the spinal cord, which is the same lining as the rest of the ventricles within the central nervous system. So now, let's focus on each of these zones, basically go through the most important nuclei you'll find, and we'll start with the anterior horn. So the anterior horn is pretty easy because it primarily consists of motor nuclei. Their axons leave the spinal cord as motor root of the spinal nerve. So that's mostly it for the anterior horn. The posterior horn is associated with receiving sensory information. You will notice that it consists of several nuclei responsible for certain types of sensory information. So the first one is the marginal nucleus, consisting of interneurons triggered by any sensory neuron coming from the spinal nerve. And then there's the gelatinous substance, which also consists of interneurons that modulate sensory inputs. Then there's the Nucleus Proprius, which consists of neurons that modulate sensory input like pain and touch and temperature. They take the information and send them upwards to the higher senses. After that, we have the posterior thoracic nucleus, which receives unconscious proprioceptive movements, basically giving information about the position and posture of the body. So that was the posterior horn. Now, let's do the intermediate zone. And the first nucleus here is the intermedio-medial nucleus, since it's located medially within the gray matter. This nucleus has more or less the same function as the posterior thoracic nucleus, which is unconscious proprioception. And some sources consider the posterior thoracic nucleus as a part of the intermediate zone, not a part of the posterior horn. So keep this in mind that some sources might vary. But there are two more nuclei within the intermediate zone, and they're located within the lateral horn. Remember we mentioned this earlier? So in the lateral horn, we will find two different nuclei depending on where we are within the spinal cord. If we are between the spinal segments C8 through L2, we will have the intermedial lateral nucleus, which consists of sympathetic fibers for the fight or flight response. And they will send their fibers together with the motor fibers down through the anterior root of the spinal nerve. If we're looking at segments between S2 and S4, we will see the sacral parasympathetic nuclei, which also sends their fibers through the anterior root of the spinal nerve, responsible for the rest and digest state of the person. So the intermediate column consists of the intermedial medial nucleus, intermedial lateral nucleus, sacral parasympathetic nucleus, and the posterior thoracic nucleus, if your sources say so. Alright, so now we've covered the majority of nuclei within all three zones of the gray matter. Along the outer part of the gray matter, you will find a very thin layer of white matter called fasciculi proprii, which are fibers that connect adjacent parts of the gray matter together, or adjacent segments, because you can also divide the gray matter into segments. Another thing you will find is gray matter that is pressed into the white matter called spinal reticular formation, or formatio reticularis spinalis, which continues upwards into the brainstem. It consists of neurons that make a communicative network for activating certain sensory information for basic living. So it regulates respiration and heartbeat and blood pressure and all of those things. And here's maybe a better representation of the spinal reticular formation. And again, it goes upwards into the brainstem. So that was all for the gray matter of the spinal cord. Now let's do the white matter. The white matter of the spinal cord, remember, it's nerve tissue rich in myelinated axons. So we're not talking about nucleus anymore, we're talking about tracts or bundles of fibers. And the white matter is divided into three portions, because you will find connective tissue separating these three portions. We have the posterior funiculus, the lateral funiculus, and the anterior funiculus. So again, these funiculi are bundles of fibers that are surrounded by connective tissue. And before we go detailed into each of these funiculi, I want to spend a little bit of time explaining the general arrangement of fibers within the white matter. And by understanding that, the tracts will get much more logical. Alright, so nerve fibers are arranged in bundles or tracts, right? So here are many neurons. There are connective tissue around all of those neurons, and that is what we call a tract. And there are three directions these tracts can go. They can either go up as ascending tracts or afferent tracts. Remember, A stands for arrive, so these tracts arrive to the brain. But they can also descend, go down as descending tracts or efferent tracts. E stands for exit. So the ascending tracts receive sensory information from anywhere in the body and sends them up to your higher senses to make sense out of them. And then once you've done that, you might want to react to the sensory information, or you just want to move a muscle in general, so you activate the descending tracts. Say you accidentally put your hand above something hot, sensory information is sent up, and then you react by descending tracts, activating muscles to remove your hand. And again, all of that happens through funiculi, which means long ropes found within the posterior, lateral, and anterior part of the spinal cord. The ascending and the descending tracts can further be divided into two parts. The ascending tracts are generally divided into unconscious and conscious sensory information. Now, what is the difference? Well, everything that goes to the cortex of your cerebrum is considered conscious. Unconscious sensory information goes to the cerebellum. The cerebellum is an organ responsible for balance and posture, so unconscious ascending tracts relay unconscious proprioceptive sensation. And you will see this word a lot as you study the tracts of the central nervous system, so it's important that you have a general knowledge about it. Unconscious proprioception is responsible for posture, meaning sensory fibers from muscles are all the time sent to the cerebellum so that it can activate the necessary muscles to keep your posture, as well as activating muscles supporting your joints and the natural position of your limbs. So information about joint stability is considered unconscious proprioception as well. But there's one more thing. Imagine you're outside, walking and you're minding your own business. All of a sudden, you see a car driving towards you and brakes right in front of you. Your initial response is tensing your muscles, a process called feed-forward control. Your muscle tenses due to something in the external environment, and in the majority of times, you're not in control of it, and we consider this unconscious proprioception as well. They're unconscious because they go to the cerebellum, which is this organ right here. In our spinal cord, we have tracts called the anterior spinocerebellar tract and the lateral spinocerebellar tract. They end with the word cerebellar, so they go to the cerebellum. Conscious sensory information relay conscious proprioception, like kinesia, which is conscious muscle movement. The conscious joint position is considered a part of the system, as well as the sense of force, meaning as you're standing, you consciously know that there's a force acting against you, which is the floor against your feet. The conscious sensory information is also responsible for sensing certain things like touch and pain and pressure and temperature. Examples of conscious ascending tracts are the anterior and the lateral spinothalamic tract, the cuneate and the gracial fascicle, which will send information to the cortex of the cerebrum. So that is the ascending tracts. But we also divide the descending tracts into two parts. We divide it into involuntary movements and voluntary movements. So one of the important parts of our cerebral cortex is the primary motor cortex. If you look at it underneath the microscope, you will find it consists of pyramidal cells. They are pyramidal because they literally look like pyramids. So when you decided you wanted to click on this video or search internal surface of the spinal cord on YouTube, you activated the pyramidal cells to give commands to your muscles. All the tracts that come from the pyramidal cells are called voluntary movements, and they help you make fine conscious movements, like when you're writing with a pen. These movements are so precise that they make your handwriting look good. These tracts usually start with the name cortico, like the anterior corticospinal tract and the lateral corticospinal tract. When motor fibers doesn't come from the pyramidal cells, they're called extrapyramidal tracts, meaning these tracts originate from other parts of the brain instead of the primary motor cortex. So these movements are movements you don't really think about, like keeping your balance and posture when you're walking, as well as rough movements or coarse movements. These tracts doesn't come from the primary motor cortex, so they have other names like the rubrospinal tract, tectospinal tract, and olivospinal tract. So I hope this made a little sense, because once you visualize this part, the next part of this video will become much easier to understand. So let's now start by talking about the tracts within each of these funiculi, and we will start with the posterior one. So in this diagram, I've made the blue colors represent sensory fibers, and the red ones representing motor fibers. The posterior funiculus has two sensory fibers, and the first one is called funiculus gracilis. This tract conducts impulses from the lower parts of the trunk and the lower limbs, so it's present in all the segments of the spinal cord, and it takes the information to the cortex. And since it brings information to the cortex, then remember, its function is conscious sensation. In this case, it's responsible for the epicritic sensibility of the lower parts of the body. Epicritic sensibility means conscious proprioception, which remember is kinesia, joint position, and the sense of force. But epicritic sensibility also means receiving information from the mechanoreceptors. Now, what does that mean? It senses two-point discrimination, so the minimal distance between two touch points until you actually sense that there are two objects touching you. That is the two-point discrimination. Mechanoreceptors also sense vibration and touch, so all of those things are what we call epicritic sensibility. The other ascending tract of the posterior funiculus is the fasciculus cuneatus, which brings sensory information from the upper body and sends it to the cortex. So it does exactly the same as the funiculus gracilis, just for the upper body. And since this tract is only for the upper body, you will find this tract only above the T6 spinal cord segment. So that was all for the posterior funiculus. Fasciculus gracilis for the lower limb and fasciculus cuneatus for the upper limb. I used the letter G in gracilis as genitals to remember that the gracilis is for the lower part of the body. Next, let's do the lateral and the anterior funiculus together, because you will find tracts that do the same but are present on both the lateral and the anterior funiculus. And just remember that they are divided by connective tissue. These two funiculi are divided by connective tissue and will represent the connective tissue using these two brown lines. The first tract are ascending tracts located on the lateral funiculus, called the spinocerebellar tract. We have two. There's the anterior spinocerebellar tract and the lateral spinocerebellar tract. Before ascending up, the posterior spinocerebellar tract receives sensory input from the posterior thoracic nucleus, and the anterior spinocerebellar tract receives sensory input from the intermedio-medial nucleus. They then ascend to the cerebellum because they both end with the word cerebellum. And remember, if something ascends to the cerebellum and not the cerebral cortex, then they provide unconscious proprioception, which later will provide unconscious contractions of muscles for posture, joint stability, and the feed-forward control system. So that is the spinocerebellar tract. Next, we have the spinothalamic tract, and there are two spinothalamic tracts in our spinal cord. There's the anterior spinothalamic tract in the anterior funiculus, and the lateral spinothalamic tract in the lateral funiculus. These two tracts are formed by axons coming from the Nucleus Proprius, and then they ascend to the cortex. And since they go to the cortex, they're responsible for conscious sensation of pain, temperature, pressure, and touch. So that was all the sensory tracts of the spinal cord. Now, let's do the motor tracts, or the descending tracts. This includes the corticospinal tract. We have two corticospinal tracts. There's the anterior corticospinal tract in the anterior funiculus and the lateral corticospinal tract in the lateral funiculus. These tracts starts with the name cortico, meaning they come from the pyramidal cells of the primary motor cortex, so they're pyramidal tracts. Now the lateral and the anterior corticospinal tracts descend differently, but they both synapse with the motor nuclei to stimulate motor fibers in the anterior root of the spinal nerve. Alright, so the lateral corticospinal tract starts off at the cortex and then they descend, but they decussate at the medulla oblongata, meaning they cross to the other side, as you see here at the medulla oblongata, and form the decussation of pyramids. And then they descend further as the lateral corticospinal tract in the spinal cord and synapse with the motor nuclei. The anterior corticospinal tract is a little bit different in that they descend without crossing. Instead, they cross at each segment they're going to leave from. So in this example, if they're going to leave at this segment, they will cross to the other side and then synapse with the motor nuclei. And since they come from the cortex, they're responsible for conscious movements. So that is the corticospinal tract. Next, we have the rubrospinal tract. Rubro means red, and the reason why they're called rubrospinal tract is because we have red nuclei located inside the midbrain of the brainstem. So these fibers are extrapyramidal fibers because they originate from the red nucleus of the midbrain and go down as the rubrospinal tract. And remember, extrapyramidal tracts are responsible for fine coordination of movements and support voluntary movements. So they make our voluntary movements more precise. So that is the rubrospinal tract. The next tract is the tectospinal tract, located in the anterior funiculus. It transmits motor impulses for the eyes and neck muscles, meaning they coordinate the eyes and the neck muscles when you look at something. So imagine you're looking at a hamburger. You're looking at it and you keep looking at it as it passes you, and your neck muscles follow your eyes. That is what the tectospinal tract is responsible for. It's called the tectospinal tract because it comes from the tectum of the midbrain, which is located on the posterior surface of the midbrain, which is on your brainstem, and then they descend and synapse with the motor nuclei. It's extrapyramidal, so it unconsciously moves your neck muscles with your eyes. Next is the vestibulospinal tract. Inside of your ear, the inner ear, you have a system called the vestibular system. The vestibular system has crystals within it sensing position of your head, whether your head is tilted upside down or to the side. All of that is sensed, and through nerves, it's sent to the brainstem and then down to the spinal cord to keep your balance and posture. So the vestibulospinal tract is responsible for keeping your balance and posture. So if you're running and you trip on a rock and you're about to fall, your vestibular system, along with other systems, will quickly react to that and activate the necessary muscles in order for you to keep your balance. And this happens involuntarily because this tract doesn't originate from the primary motor cortex, it comes from the brainstem. So that is the vestibulospinal tract. Next, we have the olivospinal tract. The olivospinal tract is also responsible for balance and posture. Inside of your medulla oblongata, there are olivary nuclei that send out fibers to the spinal cord as the olivospinal tract, which also synapse with the motor nuclei. So keep this in mind that all motor tracts will synapse with the motor nuclei of the gray matter. Then we have the reticulospinal tract. We have a lateral reticulospinal tract and a medial reticulospinal tract, which are also a part of the balance and posture system. They come from the reticular formation inside of the brainstem and also from the reticular formation of the spinal cord. Remember, we talked about that earlier? Just to remind you again, the reticular formation are responsible for sleep, alertness, cardiovascular control, breathing, and all of those vital things, but they're also responsible for motor control, like your balance and posture, through the reticulospinal tract. So that is all of these. Then lastly, there's the medial longitudinal fascicle located in the anterior funiculus, only in the cervical segments, which coordinate involuntary movements of the head and neck and eyes through synapses between the cranial nerves. And they're also going to synapse with the motor nuclei of the gray matter as well. So that was all I had for the gray matter and the white matter of the spinal cord. I made this table for the nuclei in the gray matter, and this is where this video gets scary. I am going to make all of these names disappear. Now can you, from the beginning, tell me what is the name of number 1, what is the name of number 2, and so on. And here is one for the white matter as well. You can pause the video if you want to and have a look, and then here's an empty table for you to fill. So that was everything I had for the anatomy of the spinal cord. If you found this video helpful, please put a like, comment, share, whatever you find convenient to you. The next video is going to be about the medulla oblongata.